Welcome to this grab bag on worked examples. John Sweller said this. According to research by John Sweller, who's the originator of cognitive load theory and numerous others, worked examples are more effective than problem solving as a learning tool for novices because, crucially, a worked example reduces students' cognitive load. And this is known as the worked example effect. So what are worked examples? What's the cognitive science behind them? And perhaps most importantly, how can we use them in our teaching? So the first thing to note is that a worked example is not merely an example. For instance, I could show you a free kick by Gareth Bale and say, right, that's what it should look like. So now off you go. Would you be able to go and do it? Well, I suppose you might get lucky, but in all likelihood, unless I break down the skill and give you some tips for where to place your feet, where to strike the ball, and so on, you're unlikely to be able to replicate that example at anything like the level that either of us is looking for. And even worse, if I only give you examples and fail to show you how to replicate them, you might even get a little bit demotivated at being asked to try again and again. And as a teacher, I could satisfy myself that I'd shown you a good example, but from a learner's perspective, how useful was that example, especially if you're a novice? So a worked example is one where the components of the example, every step of the whole process, are made explicit to the learner. The concept is the same whether we're talking about a free kick or a quadratic equation or baking a pie or writing an exam answer. It really is the same process. So what counts as a worked example? In a worked example, the teacher or the lecturer provides a completed version of the final task for the students to look at, to consider, to think about. But then crucially, the lecturer also provides the students with a step-by-step explanation of his or her thought process and actions in the completion of that task or that skill. It might be a walkthrough, a demonstration, an annotation, a completed calculation, something like this. It's not simply sharing or showing what you're looking for, but also guiding the students on how to get there. So why would you want to use a worked example? And this is where we lean on some of the ideas of cognitive load theory. Remember, the theory tells us that we have essentially unlimited long-term memory storage, but that working memory is very limited. And we can consciously deliberate over and think about only a small handful of items or elements at any given time. And so it becomes something of a bottleneck to our long-term memory or our learning. So we have to be really careful to manage how much load we place on the working memory. Otherwise, we run the risk of not learning what we hoped to learn. A worked example helps us to manage cognitive load. That is the load placed on working memory, so that our learners don't become overloaded. It's a useful first step in a scaffolding strategy, and so it has relevance to learners who are novices in particular, or in that topic or task or skill. It's less relevant for an expert, but that's not the focus for now. Let's say, for example, you want to teach your students how to write a history essay. The task has a problem. That's the title and the intent of the essay itself. It has a bunch of necessary steps or processes. That's putting the events of history in the right order, selecting relevant quotations, sources, evidence, structuring the paragraphs, and so on. There's also a particular solution, a target or an outcome that's expected. In this case, it's completing the essay along with analytical comment and independent conclusions. Now, if the teacher simply poses the problem to a novice and sets the learners off to discover the answer or to write the essay, this places a huge intrinsic cognitive load onto the learner's working memory. Because the learner has to identify the nature of the problem, the task or the question, then they have to sift through their long-term memory to find all the various possible steps and strategies and knowledge that might be needed to solve the problem. And if they really are novices, they may not have any strategies or previous knowledge. And then they've got to try and implement the solution or complete the task itself. And so you can see very quickly this leads to cognitive overload. A worked example, on the other hand, allows a teacher to manage the cognitive load placed on the students by presenting a fully completed example of the target task, so the essay, for example, including the problem, the process, and the solution, and then selecting elements of that task to direct the student attention towards. Now we're working towards the completed task, but we're managing the cognitive load as we do so. In our example, you could provide a completed essay and then discuss each of the steps, such as selecting from the available sources, each step in isolation, but with the end goal tacitly in sight. You might also annotate a poem live in class, discuss your thought processes as you do so. You might demonstrate how to lead a client through a warm-up or demonstrate how to feed a particular animal. And as you do it, step by step, you verbalize your thoughts and your actions. And I'll leave you to think through your own subject and where you might be able to make use of the worked example effect. But here are the key points. Firstly, provide a demonstration or a completed version of the final task. Provide the whole thing, the problem, the process, and the solution, and give it to the students as a completed piece. And then comes the key part. Direct the students' attention to small chunks of the task. Get them to think about the example one piece at a time. You can do this either afterwards, looking back on your demonstration, or you can do it whilst you're demonstrating. Then guide practice. Guide the practice of those small chunks before you ask the students to complete the whole task. Now, once all the parts are in place, you can then dispense with the worked examples for that task. Now, finally here, according to researchers Grosser and Renkel, students should always complete a problem or a task after being shown the worked example. And that doesn't have to happen in a single lesson, that can happen over a course of lessons. And wherever possible, try and give 2 or more worked examples. Well, I hope that's been helpful. Here are the references which you can chase up if you'd like to, or feel free to contact me with any thoughts or questions, and I'll see you in the next video.